We finally made it. It's the last of our fortnight of fantasy deep dives, and what a way to end it. NFC West champions have made it to the Super Bowl in 7 of the last 11 years, so there's no shortage of talent in this division. From fantasy superstars to elite rookies, we'll break them all down on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. Thank you for joining us on the last of our fantasy deep dives. We've broken down all 32 teams in the NFL for fantasy football. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe. You can also follow us on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down and on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. All of my rankings are at ffdfantasyfootball.com, and you can check out my articles on Razzball as well. Today, we're talking about the NFC West, and there is a lot of quality here and a lot of fantastic fantasy players. But it starts out a little bit ugly with the Arizona Cardinals.
The Arizona Cardinals select Marvin Harrison Jr.
33. He'll force this one down the field.
3rd and 6. McCord luffs it. Harrison makes the grab. Looking for the end zone. Harrison one-on-one. He's got it. A one-man wrecking crew.
Play right here from the franchise quarterback. Murray running for his life. Murray trying to buy some time. Murray gets a couple of blockers. Murray's going to run for it. He's got it. Here. One time out. Murray catches. Split out here. Murray puts it out. That pass is caught. McBride in left. Murray puts him there under it. Near side of the comebacker. McBride. Dobbs, deep shot. And Wilson has it. 3rd and 13. Lawrence to Jones. He's got it out of bounds.
Coming in on that blitz. And they gave it to Connor. A great decision by Dobbs. Fresh set of downs for Arizona. Right back to Connor. Makes the inside cut. Shuts up.
The Cardinals don't make it to the playoffs very often, so it's kind of surprising to think it was only a couple of years ago that they were in the wild card slot. Back-to-back 4-13 seasons, however, have led to a total rebuild, and that means there's a lot of young talent on this roster. We kind of know what to expect now from Jonathan Gannon and Drew Petzing, so we don't have to think about what's going to happen offensively too much. We just got to think who's going to be in those roles, and they've brought in a heap of young talent. They've obviously got Trey Benson and Marvin Harrison Jr. through the draft. They've also brought in some backups, and they've also got Zay Jones as a receiving option as well. So they've brought in enough talent. The problem is they don't have enough good veterans around them. So I think they're still going to struggle this year. If you look at the guys that they've gone out the door, realistically, they've just replaced most guys like for like, and they're still paying big money to players who aren't that great. Most of their money is going to safeties, which is a weird place to be spending your money, and linebackers. All those guys should be cheap players on your roster. So it tells you they haven't got the quality on the O-line and the D-line. They're paying up against Kyler Murray, which is why they weren't able to draft a quarterback. And they're not really spending their money logically anywhere else. That kind of makes sense because they got a whole heap of cap space. And they're basically signaling to us, hey, we're not challenging this year. We're still rebuilding. And I think that's a reasonable approach. It just means that for fantasy, they're going to have some struggles. So let's have a look at what we should expect. Kyler Murray remains the quarterback, and realistically, he's been a little bit up and down. He's struggled to stay healthy, but even when he's been healthy, he's been way too inaccurate. He's very useful for fantasy because of his rushing game, but that's going to slowly start to fade as time goes on. And I think there's a bit of a limit to his fantasy value here. There's also a real risk that in a couple of seasons, they decide they're going to move on from Kyler, and then he could end up anywhere in any role. So while there's certainly some risk, the rushing floor certainly gives him plenty of upside for now. The reason I'm taking him lower in Dynasty is because I don't even know whether he's going to be playing and where he's going to be playing in a couple of years' time. It wouldn't surprise me if the Cardinals have a rookie quarterback within a couple of seasons, based on the fact that they're realistically still rebuilding. The run game's certainly going to be very strong, though. James Conner, to me, is actually one of the best elite, pure running backs in the NFL. And then they bring in Trey Benson. I think that's down to Connor being very injury prone. We can see 4 of the last 5 seasons, he's missed at least 3 games due to injury. I mean, there's no reason to think that won't continue. He's also not getting any younger. So they bring Benson in. This is going to be a committee straight out the gate. I don't know exactly what this committee is going to look like. They were trying to take some of the load off Connor last season. They tried using Carter. They tried using Demicado. They brought in a heap of different guys, honestly, to try to take that load off Connor and keep him healthy. It just didn't work. So they go and actually draft a guy who can do it properly and eventually take over from this lead role. Benson's going to be good in a couple of seasons' time, but I do think in this season, it's probably Connor starting out the gate and they slowly transition across to Benson, but this is still going to be very much a committee. How that split looks, well, I think it's going to be somewhere between 50-50 and 70-30, but I don't know in whose favor. I think it probably starts in Connor's favor, slowly drifts across towards 50-50. For that reason, I'm not really interested in any of these guys as running backs in fantasy redraft this year. But in Dynasty, at least you know that Benson has a little bit of upside as a guy who will grow into a role and is very talented. He easily could have been the best running back off the board, especially if Brooks' injury was a little bit more serious. So I do think there's plenty of upside here with Benson. I'm just not willing to take him if I need to win this year. I'm probably thinking a couple of years down the road with this pick. The wide receivers are guys that can produce straight away. Well, one of them is. Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to be amazing in the NFL. He's one of the best prospects we've seen come out in a long time. It's not the best landing spot, but we have seen Kyler be able to produce with proper fantasy wide receivers before. There's no reason to think that won't happen here with Harrison. I expect he gets a whole lot of targets because there's not a lot of competition there. Michael Wilson really struggled in his rookie season. Zay Jones is good, but he's getting a little bit older, and realistically, he's just a complimentary wide receiver at this point in time. Everyone else they've got behind those guys are just guys as well. So Harrison is going to be the guy. He's my 5th wide receiver off the board in Dynasty, but there is a reasonable argument to take him even earlier than that, especially if you're doing an actual rebuild or planning on being pretty young. I'd be taking Harrison as early as the 2nd or 3rd overall pick in a Dynasty startup, if that's my plan. If I'm planning on going young, that's an option you've got. You can also do the same thing if you're drafting a super flex team. You need to get some good wide receivers in after you've gone young with your quarterbacks. It makes sense to start with guys like Harrison or Neighbors. So I like him from that perspective as well. He's going to be a good wide receiver in this league for a long time. The hit rate on guys drafted in this range is very good, and he is a true elite prospect that deserved to go with that pick as well. The tight end room's a little bit interesting. We know they brought in a 3rd rounder in Tip Ryman, but he's very much a blocking back. Look at his college stats. That's at college. You're not going to produce much in the NFL if you can't produce at collegiate level. So I'm not expecting him to be much of a receiving back. The only situation where I can imagine that happens is a couple of years down the road. If there's a McBride injury, potentially Ryman turns into the guy they just have to go to because he's their only other viable option. I do think that probably Elijah Higgins is the backup there, but I think Ryman's at least going to see the field as the blocking back. It's all about Trey McBride, though, for fantasy here. McBride is someone that I don't love as much as many people do because I think when Harrison comes in, McBride loses a lot of those targets. He was the clear number 1 option because they had nobody else, and he was very good in that position, but I'm dialing him back just a little bit because I do think there's going to be a bit of a drop-off with Marvin Harrison Jr. coming in. I'm still expecting him to get, 80 towards 100% snaps, running routes a lot of that time. That's really good for fantasy. I just think there's other guys who have a little bit more upside as the true number 1 options in their teams or as slightly more talented players. Now let's move on to recent Super Bowl champions, the LA Rams.
First. Stafford over the middle. What a throw. Stafford fires. The throw of the catch. Stafford again tries to scramble and now launches downfield and wide open is Puka Nacua.
Off the play action. Stafford has to step away from pressure, looking for Atwell on the sideline. Stafford with backside pressure has to get rid of it into traffic and Nacua with the catch and the toe tap. These Seahawks on 2nd and 8 looking for the tight end. He finds Higbee and Higbee inside the Seattle 4.
Stafford throws near side. Cooper Kupp inside the 20.
Stafford going deep. He's got Kupp open. He's got it.
There's a motion on first down, only the 4th one of the day for the Rams, and it's Kyron Williams. 5 rushing touchdowns, first 4 games. Here's Williams inside the 40.
Williams in the ball game. They hand it to Corum again and makes the cut. First down. Spins and scores.
Corum with a hole down the sideline. Gonna get there. Blake the Great. Corum dancing. Corum breaks a tackle to the end zone. Blake the Great.
The Rams risked it all a couple of years ago for the ring, and it paid off. That led to a rebuild in 2022, and I don't think anyone really expected them to be back in the playoffs last year. And yet that's exactly where they were. Sean McVay's done a really good job of rebuilding this team quickly, and there's plenty of talent. They're spending money across the O-line, which is really sensible when you've got a quarterback like Matthew Stafford, who is aging and not particularly mobile. They've given him plenty of weapons here, and they've tried to establish a really strong running game, and it's worked. They've drafted really sensibly, and there's a lot of good fantasy weapons in here. You can also look, if you look at their contract situation, while they're paying a lot of money to those older veterans, they haven't signed them for the long term. I think they realize that their Super Bowl window's the next couple of years, and they've got no one signed past 2026, which is really unusual if you look back at what a lot of the other teams have been doing. They also have very little dead cap space. They're using their money really sensibly, putting everyone on short contracts, doing the opposite of what a lot of those teams are doing, and it seems to be working for them. If you also look at the players they've got coming in, they're mostly bringing in just sensible, cheap veterans who can play a role, knowing they've already got most of the right talent there already. The real only big name coming in is Blake Corum, and we'll talk about the running backs in a second. But first, let's talk about that quarterback, Matthew Stafford, who's a really good quarterback, and he has been for a long time. He's just not going to be a fantasy superstar. He doesn't do anything with his legs. He's becoming a little bit more inconsistent as time goes on, though he's still been solid. He's got a whole lot of wide receiver weapons. I think in redraft, he's the kind of guy that you can take very late in drafts, and he's going to be functional for you. But in Dynasty, you're just not going to get a lot out of him. He's probably only got 1 or 2 seasons left in him at best. I'm not really worried about Garoppolo coming in and taking over. He's clearly there as a backup, and I don't really buy it with Stetson Bennett either. I think that in a couple of years, they just do a proper rebuild and they end up with a rookie quarterback, but it's going to be Stafford for at least the next year or two. I would be drafting him very late in dynasty leagues, especially in superflex leagues, and using him if I'm planning on winning right now, because I think he does give you that upside in the superflex league. Outside of superflex league, I'm really not sure in what situation you want to be using him in dynasty. If you're trying to win now, you can probably do better. But if you're not trying to win now, well, why would you get a guy that's only going to be around for a year or two? He's really only an option in dynasty superflex and in redraft leagues where you're punting quarterback and you're going to take one late. The running back room is interesting. Kyren Williams was excellent last year. He was a top 5 running back, and he missed a heap of games as well. I think the fact that he missed a lot of games is one of the reasons they've gone out to get Blake Corum. Corum has shown out as being a really good running back in OTAs, and I think we expected that. He looks good for Michigan as well. He's not a particularly big guy, but he's very effective. Now, how is this running back room going to look? I still think it's going to be mainly Williams. I think they've brought Corum in more as a backup and more as someone that can take a little bit of the load off Kyren Williams. There were games last year where Williams was literally out there on every offensive snap. That's not a particularly effective way of keeping your running back healthy. I think they were a little bit surprised in just how good Williams was, and they've recognized, oh, we actually need someone that can take a little bit of this load off him because it's not going to last if we're going to have him out there every single snap. So they brought Corum in as that backup guy. I don't even think of this as being a committee. I think of this as Williams being the number 1 guy and Corum being a high-value handcuff. If Williams goes down, I think that Corum's probably out there most of the time, and then he becomes a league winner. But people are probably going to draft him a little bit early, thinking that he's going to have a really fantasy-relevant role in this offense straight away. I think that's only going to happen if Williams goes down. This rushing game is going to be good, but I do think Williams is going to be out there about 3/4 of the time, and that's not going to give enough value to Corum. So I'm still taking Williams relatively early, understanding there's a little bit of risk there. And Corum's a guy that I'm interested in as a handcuff, but I don't want to be relying on him as a starter. You've just got to understand with either of these guys, there is plenty of risk, so don't reach for them in drafts. There are other safer options that still have pretty high ceilings around rather than either of these 2 guys, so I'd only be taking them if they fall relative to their value. The wide receiver room has been led by Puka Nacua, and I did not see this coming, I've got to admit. I've talked about my colleague Kiwi, who works with me at FFD. He called this a mile away. He tends to get this right every single year. He's all about Puka last year, and he was absolutely spot on. Nacua looked fantastic. I don't expect another top 5 season from him, but I do still think he's going to be very good for the long term. I do think that when Cooper Kupp actually comes back properly and looks healthy, it might affect Nacua slightly, but I think we're starting to see Kupp starting to fall off towards the end of his career, and that should mean that Nacua is at least the number 1 guy in this offense. They've cycled guys around behind him, but I think realistically it's probably Demarcus Robinson as the main number 3 option. And he has a small amount of fantasy value in very deep leagues. If you need a guy that you can fill into a flex option in a really deep league, I think Robinson's the kind of guy you can use there, but he does really lack upside. Even if Kupp or Nacua gets injured, realistically, Robinson's still just going to be an afterthought compared to those guys. It's also probably time to be dropping guys like Tutu Atwell. I know that we saw him start at times last year, but I think Robinson is going to have the clear number 3 job here. So Nacua is a real top option, someone that you can be taking very early in drafts, probably late first round, early second round in dynasty startups, assuming it's not super flex. And Kupp's a guy that you're really only interested in if you're trying to win now. And even then, he's not really offering you much more than wide receiver 2 kind of output. So if you have Kupp and you're not trying to win immediately, or you have better depth, I'd be trying to sell him to somebody who's going to be a little bit excited by that name recognition, because realistically, he is more name than output at this point in time. The tight end room is going to be a little bit of a mess. Tyler Higbee's actually had some really good seasons recently, but I'm not really convinced it's going to happen this year. They brought in Colby Parkinson. He is excellent in the red zone, which is going to take a lot of the value away from Higbee. I also think this is going to turn into a little bit more of a committee, especially as time goes on. So Higbee, even though he was out there on most of the snaps last season, wasn't overly effective. I don't see that changing much this year. I think they're transitioning a lot more towards wide receiver heavy type plays. We've seen that happen with McVay's offenses in the past. I don't think you particularly want either of these guys. I don't think there's going to be a lot of 2 tight end sets. I just think they're going to be cycling between Higbee and Parkinson. I don't want either of them for fantasy. A lot of players I do want for fantasy, though, are on the San Francisco 49ers.
Of terrible football. We've got the ball. Let's see what we can do with it to start the half.
Trying to do something here with Christian McCaffrey. Got a bruising block from Brandon Ayuk. Got another from Ray McLeod. Turned it into a touchdown.
Appreciation for him going through the read.
Holmes going deep for Ayuk and a fingertip grab. Pressure. Deep. Caught. Samuel. 12. Back to the air. Purdy looking end zone. Brandon Ayuk. McCaffrey up the middle. Inside the 10. A stiff arm at the 5. No snap. No problem for Purdy. Throws. First to 10 at the 37. The end around to Deebo Samuel. Has a blocker and Kittle in front of it. And Samuel, the first come true today for the Steelers. Purdy running. And going with time. Purdy to the sideline. And a juggling attempt and the catch by Jawan Jennings.
Drops back. They rush 4. Myers down the right side. One-handed catch leaping in the air. Pearsall brought it down at the 30-yard line. Are you kidding me?
2nd and 5 and around. Ricky Pearsall. Here goes Ricky. And the Gators. What a response.
The 49ers has done everything but win a ring over the last few years, with Shanahan turning this into an absolute powerhouse of a franchise. They've got a top 3 offense, a top 3 defense. They've got all the pieces they need. They just haven't been able to put it together. I expect that Shanahan remains the play caller, and he's one of the best play callers around the league. He does tend to trend very pass heavy, but that's because he's got Christian McCaffrey and because he can afford to. He also does tend to lay off runs to guys like Deebo Samuel as well. So he uses all these weapons. He just uses them a lot in what's technically the run game, because there's a lot of passes backwards and a lot of handoffs to those guys. He has a surprisingly low play speed, but you can afford to do that when you're funneling all your attack through the same 4 guys, and it still ends up being very effective for fantasy. They've also got the oldest roster on the league, which is really interesting because when you look at their top players, you don't think of guys who are veterans, but they've got an aging O-line and D-line. And I think over time that's going to affect them, but they are very good at continually bringing in the right pieces. They haven't done much for fantasy from an additions perspective. Most of these guys are backups. Ricky Pearsall's really the only guy that you'd really think, oh, guy could be a fantasy asset at some time in the future. And it's not even going to be the near future. They haven't lost any of their big fantasy guys. Look at those key fantasy losses. These are all backups at best or special teams guys. And yet they're bringing in guys who are nearly good enough to start. So they're making this offense very, very strong. I still think it's going to funnel through the same 4 players, though. So let's talk about those guys and the guy who's going to make it happen for them. It's Brock Purdy. And I know that he had the 6th overall fantasy finish last year. I don't think that was Purdy. I think that was Shanahan. I think that was McCaffrey. I think that was Kittle. I think it was Debo. I think it was Ayuk. It wasn't Brock Purdy. Brock Purdy's just a functional quarterback. He's absolutely fine. He's accurate enough. They're able to take the lid off the opposition defense because their run game is so strong and teams have to feel like they kind of have to stack up the box a little bit against them. And that means that he's able to be very accurate, deep and medium with his throws. And there's really very rarely any pressure on him to actually perform because of the play scheming, because of how good the weapons around him are. So I think that even though he's solid for fantasy at the moment, I don't see him as a guy who's going to be a long-term fantasy option. I know he's young, but I think that realistically, when he doesn't have elite weapons around him, he's going to get found out. And at some point in time, we're going to get to a situation where Purdy's not even a starter in the league. So he's not someone I particularly want on my team. If I've got him already, I mean, that's fine. I don't think there's people going out of their way trying to buy Purdy unless they're big 49ers fans. And I certainly don't think you're going to be able to buy him cheap because of last year's fantasy finish. So he's kind of one of those players who's in a bit of purgatory where you kind of just need to stick with him if you have him and not go out of your way to get him otherwise. He's certainly not someone I would particularly want in redraft leagues. And if I'm doing a dynasty startup, I'm only taking him if he happens to fall to me or if I'm really desperate. Now, let's have a look at the guys I actually do really want. Christian McCaffrey is the number 1 player in fantasy football at the moment. I know I've got him ranked number 3. That's in Dynasty. In redraft, he's the clear number 1. He'll be the first player off the board. If I have the first overall pick in any redraft league that's not Superflex, I'm definitely taking Christian McCaffrey. We've seen what he can do when he stays healthy. He's a running back, so he won't always stay healthy, and that's just the reality of all running backs. But he is someone that when he's healthy and when he's out on the field, he is going to be the number 1 guy in fantasy. There was no signs of drop-off last year, and at some stage that will happen. I don't know if it's going to be this year, but I'm willing to take that risk because the upside is so huge. He was so far and away better than everybody else that he's someone you just need to have in fantasy. If you're trying to win now, I would be moving heaven and earth to try to get him on my team because you know he's such a big difference maker. Where things get interesting is the backups. Last year it was Elijah Mitchell, and he is the clear backup. The problem is he's not much of a passing down back. They don't really use him much in the receiving game. I think that we probably see Garendo do that a little bit more. I think that's kind of the reason they brought him in here. He had quite a few receptions for a college back. College game is mostly on the ground. They don't really check down to their running backs a lot. So Garendo is going to be used out of the backfield in that way a little bit, but only if McCaffrey gets injured. I think this is a situation where realistically, it's all McCaffrey with a little bit of Mitchell and Garendo to spell him. But if McCaffrey goes down, then this turns into a committee. And that kind of takes the value away from both of these backups. Although I do think that Mitchell has more value if you're looking at either of these handcuffs. And if you're in a dynasty league where you're trying to fill your bench with upside guys, I think Mitchell at least has some upside. We've seen that he can be very effective when given the chance. The problem is he's really struggled to stay healthy himself. 3 injury-affected seasons in a row is not ideal. So it would be interesting to see what happens with Garendo if Mitchell goes down as well. Or even if Mitchell goes down and McCaffrey's healthy, maybe Garendo can make a statement to be the true backup. The wide receiver room's in a state of flux at the moment. We don't really know what's happening. Brandon Ayuk has been basically going out and saying to Jaden Daniels, hey, 49ers don't want me. Now, we don't know whether that means the 49ers don't want him now, whether they don't want him at some point in the future, whether they're not willing to give him a contract he wants, whether they're not willing to give him a contract at all. It would surprise me a lot if they're not offering him anything. I would assume that he's saying that the 49ers aren't offering him enough to stay at the team, that he doesn't feel like they value him. Now, to be fair, I think Ayuk is overvaluing himself a little bit. He is a good wide receiver. He's a very good blocking wide receiver, which is more valuable to the 49ers than most other teams. But I honestly do think that he realistically isn't going to get the contract he wants here. There is going to be a team that's willing to pay him more than he deserves. And I think that means that he's probably going to move on, but probably not till the end of this season. So that means if you're looking at guys like Ricky Pearsall, you're not thinking for this year. You're thinking down the track. And that does lower his value in Dynasty for me, because most of the other guys are going to be good straight away. Whenever you have a player who comes in and isn't going to be a regular starter immediately, their value drops not only because you can't use them in that first year, but also because it is possible that they'll just all get lost in everything that's happening there and end up falling away, never get that starting job after all. That has happened plenty of times to early picks. Someone who did get a contract is Deebo Samuel. I don't think he's a true number one receiver. He's a very good offensive weapon, but he's not the kind of guy you want to run your passing game through. For that reason, I think that after Ayuk goes, and I think he probably will go at the end of this season, I think it's probably Deebo, Pearsall, and I think they probably hang around with Juwan Jennings, who's such a good blocking wide receiver. I think this first year, it's probably about 50% Pearsall and about 50% Jennings, with Jennings out there on a lot of the run plays. So Pearsall will have some limited value. I do just worry about whether he's able to actually take over a lead role in this team. I don't really see it happening. It's also a bit weird that we've got three guys that are all pretty good slot receivers. I know they do tend to line their wide receivers up quite tight a lot of the time, but I'm a little bit nervous about how exactly that's going to look and how each player is going to be used. So I've got Pearsall a lot lower than most of the other first round, early second round guys. I think he's my 11th wide receiver rookie this year, and that's kind of why, because of the overall picture of this room. Plus, it's absolutely not impossible that Ayuk does sign a contract in the end, that he brings his requirements down a little bit and is willing to sign with a team that's more likely to win him a ring, having looked around and seen what else is available to him. The tight end room is all about George Kittle. He's been fantastic for a long time. Obviously, he's getting a little bit older, but he remains one of the best blocking tight ends, and I don't think he's going anywhere. Plus, when he's healthy, he keeps on performing. He's been a top 5 tight end for the last 3 seasons, and realistically would have been that before that as well if he hadn't gotten injured. Injuries have been a bit of an issue for Kittle, but when he's healthy, he can be very effective. The problem is that when all the other wide receivers and McCaffrey are healthy, it does kind of drop Kittle's role a little bit more to more of a blocking tight end. And that's why I've dropped him down a little bit in my dynasty rankings. It's because he's getting older, and because that role is not as clear-cut as it used to be, where he used to be one of the top couple of passing options on this team. Now he's probably number 4. And that's still okay in this offense because they still managed to scheme up enough touches for him. It just means that he doesn't have that same upside that he used to. They've also brought in Logan Thomas. I think that's more of a backup situation. We talked about Kittle getting injured a bit. I think this is just someone they can bring into play because realistically, it wasn't working with Ross Dwelley and Charlie Warner last season. Cameron Latu's a guy I really liked actually in college, and he was injured all of last season. I think that realistically he's someone that long-term could take over from Kittle, but should you go out and get him? Well, probably not. He's a very low upside option, but I do think that in the long term, he is going to be the guy that takes over in that role. And so we have one team left, and it's the Seattle Seahawks.
Smith to throw. Pressure from Hutchinson. Runs away. Great throw. Walking down it for the end zone. It's over. The Seahawks win it. Blitz coming. Smith sees it. Fires over the middle. Metcalf makes the catch. Fakes the pass over the middle. Now floats it down the sideline. That's DK Metcalf. Metcalf for the first down and more. On the fake. Smith has time. Lofting end zone. It is caught for the touchdown. Tyler Lockett and now Smith steps away from pressure. A lot of room to run. Geno Smith using the legs. Smith has some time going down the far side of the field. It is caught. No, it's man. Smith screen. Jackson Smith-Njigba, the rookie, using his speed. And as we speak of second-year players, one of them carries the football and gets some room to the edge. A stiff arm thrown by Walker. Find out what they do. Here's Kenneth Walker looking for a seam, and a nice move for Walker, who breaks the tackle and's got a first down and more. Right play, Charbonnet trying to get to the edge. He does. Charbonnet trucks a man.
After 14 years of gum chewing, Pete Carroll finally goes from the Seahawks. He has been a very good head coach for them. They haven't had anything worse than a 7-win season. They've consistently made it into the playoffs. And I think he's built a really solid team and made it work despite not having all the best weapons around him. What's going to happen this year? Well, Mike McDonald comes in as the head coach and the defensive play caller. And we do see when we have defensive head coaches that sometimes the team can trend a little bit defensively. I don't think that's going to happen with Ryan Grubb coming in as the OC. It's hard to know exactly what to expect from Grubb because college football isn't the same as the NFL, and Grubb has realistically only been a college guy. But I do think we're going to see something that's quite similar to Washington. We've seen Pharaoh Brown, who came to the Seahawks this year, come out and say that they have had to watch a lot of tape on Washington. And that suggests that a lot of the plays that they're going to be bringing in and a lot of their scheme is going to be similar to what we saw in Washington. And that means we can at least make predictions as to what to expect from the Seahawks. I expect that means plenty of power running in their offense and a lot of deep attacks. But we also saw last year, especially with Jalen McMillan, Washington tended to use a lot of screen plays and short passes around the line of scrimmage. So I think we see a lot of that sort of thing. And then they go deep an unusually high amount of the time after they've brought all of the defenses shorter. So it's going to be a lot of short and long with a lot of verticality, high risk stuff. They'll mix up the tempo a little bit. And I'm thinking they're probably going to use a lot of 11 personnel because that's what we saw last year. And also because that's where the weapons in this attack are. That'll really change things up from last year where they had the slowest offense in the league. They were 32nd in plays per game, and they were very pass heavy. I think that probably remains the case here. They've also really spent up. They've got the least cap space across the league as well. They spent up on a lot of veterans. Obviously, Geno Smith is now their guy, their top quarterback, but they've also got solid wide receivers in Metcalf and Lockett. They've got some very young, talented guys in their secondary, particularly on defense. Their D-line's pretty solid. I really like what this team is doing. I think they're going to be a playoff team. The question is, what does it look like for fantasy? They haven't really lost or gained any fantasy options. If you look at the guys who are coming in and the guys who are leaving, none of those are guys that you think, oh, yeah, I've had DJ Dallas on my fantasy roster a whole heap of times. I don't think any of these guys are really going to impact what we see for fantasy. I think it's all going to be about the play calling. So how does that affect Geno Smith? Well, we saw him have a really good fantasy season in 2022, but I think we all knew at the time that was a little bit of a fluke. Kind of the same as Daniel Jones then, I think was 7th overall that year. Same as Brock Purdy last year was excellent. Sometimes players just pop up, they stay healthy, they have surprisingly good fantasy seasons, and then they go back to being mediocre again. I think the same thing's going to happen with Geno Smith. Geno's also not exactly young. He's now 34 years old, which is admittedly younger than me. But it does mean that he only has a couple of years left. And I don't think he's so good that he can keep playing until he is very old. We're not talking about a Tom Brady or Aaron Rodgers situation here. I think he's probably only got a couple of years left. And I do think that they're probably thinking of potentially transitioning things across to Sam Howell in the next couple of years. Although don't think that this is some sort of competition now. It's not. It is Geno Smith that's going to be the lead guy. I just don't think it's going to happen for long. Now, who are the guys he's going to be working with? Well, the running backs are going to be Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet again. I think that Walker is going to remain the lead guy. They got a surprisingly even amount of snaps, but Charbonnet tended to be out there on the passing downs and Walker tended to be out there on the running downs. And that meant that Walker got twice as many carries and still managed to get plenty of receptions because they were still checking down to him when they were in those sort of running formations because they had so many tight ends out there. They used a lot of tight ends last year. What does that mean for Walker this year? Well, he's been the running back 19 the last 2 seasons, so maybe he's the running back 19 again. We'll have to wait and see. I do think that's the kind of range that we're talking about. I think we're thinking low-end running back too. I think we're kind of seeing what they see of Charbonnet. He's more of the receiving back. He's mostly out there to block and run some routes. They will give him the ball occasionally and as a change of pace back as well, but I do think realistically it's a committee where even though the snaps are similar, the touches go more towards Walker in the long term. They don't really have anyone else as backups either. Kenny McIntosh didn't even play at all last season. He's technically their running back 3. They've only got undrafted free agents after that. Like George Halani's probably the next guy up. I mean, realistically, none of these are guys you want for fantasy. And I think that means that if Walker or Charbonnet gets injured, which happened occasionally last year, the other guy becomes very valuable because he gets a whole heap of touches. So that's the main value of getting either of these running backs. The wide receiver room is also pretty darn crowded. It's DK Metcalf that's the main guy, and we have heard a lot of talk that they want to scheme him up and make him their number one option. But I do think we're still going to see a lot of Tyler Lockett. I think Jackson Smith-Njigba probably has a slightly bigger role this year. We saw that JSN lost a lot of snaps to Jake Bobo last year, which is a little bit odd. They mostly weren't high passing down snaps, but he was still off the field an uncomfortable amount, and that kind of hurts his value from fantasy. I think that Lockett, in a redraft perspective, goes ahead of JSN, and I think that in Dynasty he drops down simply because he's aging and he's probably only got a couple of years left, whereas JSN's realistically only actually played one season. I do think that over time, Smith-Njigba becomes the clear number 2, at least here. He's more of the slot guy in this offense. I think they've traditionally used Lockett there, but they've shifted him outside a lot more. It'll be interesting to see what happens with Ryan Grubb coming in, whether that stays that way, whether they start to move these guys around a lot more. Regardless, Metcalf is the guy to own in Dynasty. He's definitely somebody I want in my team if I can get him for the right price. He's kind of that mid-range wide receiver too, and I'll definitely take him at that price if I can because he's been consistently a top 20 option if you ignore 2019 where he apparently came 345th because I can't type very accurately. Smith-Njigba is someone that you can probably get pretty cheap after his disappointing first season. If someone's not too attached to what they paid for him or the name recognition, you can probably get him if you're willing to pay wide receiver 3 type numbers for him. Tyler Lockett's only someone that's valuable to you if you're trying to win right now and you need some depth options. The tight ends have changed since last year. There were kind of 3 guys last year. It was a combination of Fant, Dissly, and Parkinson. Fant was hurt a lot by the fact that Parkinson was the main red zone guy, meaning Fant only got 2 red zone targets and no touchdowns. I don't think that's going to happen this year. I think suddenly Fant becomes the number 1 option. I would expect to see a little bit of Pharaoh Brown used as a passing option, but I think that Fant is the main guy here. So that should be really valuable, right? Maybe. I mean, realistically, I was talking about Grubb's offense being one that really runs through the wide receivers a lot, and they've got 3 really good wide receivers. They've also got a strong running game. I don't know that Fant's really going to be exactly a featured player. I think he will be the main guy, but I think AJ Barner comes in a lot as a blocking tight end. I don't think they're going to want to use a lot of tight end sets. I would say we're seeing about maybe 20, 25% 12 personnel and a whole lot of 11 personnel, and that might mean that Fant's coming off the field sometimes in those situations. So I think that Fant has some limited value. He has some upside, but he's not exactly young anymore. We kind of know what you're going to get out of him. You're going to get kind of like a mid-range tight end too. And though I'm ranking him lower than that, it's because I think he lacks the upside of some of the other guys. So not particularly excited about Fant, even though I do think there is the possibility he's out there a lot. I think he's going to have those boom games. I think he's probably going to look a lot like K. Dawson did last year, where you see those really big games, but most of the time he's a bit of an afterthought and gets 2 or 3 touches, and that's not fantastic for fantasy. And that's all we've got for our fantasy deep dives. If you haven't already, like and subscribe. I will be back very soon, in the next couple of days, in fact, and I'll be talking about OTAs. I'm going to be talking about what players moved up and down in my dynasty and rookie rankings after what we learned from OTAs. I've then also got another analysis I'm doing on first-round rookies and what to expect from them. So heaps more content here on the Fantasy First Down. You can also check us out on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down. I answer all your questions over there. On Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. And my website is ffdfantasyfootball.com, where we've got all of our content. Thanks for joining us for the last of our fantasy deep dives. I'll see you next time on the Fantasy First Down.